This is part 2 of the coffee table video. This is making the legs for the coffee table. So as this was a prototype, I wanted to try some different ways of making the legs. My first thought was to just get a piece of firewood, as I just needed a mass of wood to carve the legs from. So this was from a tree we cut down a couple of years ago, and I scraped the bark off and cut a quick shape into it, starting to get towards the shape of the leg. I'm basically making a blank for the 4th axis CNC. So I want to remove some material so I'm not cutting off as much with the router bit on the CNC. I can make a spot for the chuck on the lathe on one end and turn the piece around, and this holds the piece a lot more securely. Then it's just a matter of removing a bunch of material and getting to something that's sort of round. When I was originally modeling the table in the computer, I made a mortise and tenon between the legs and the bottom of the table. So I made the tenon on this piece, and I could use that to hold in the chuck of the 4th axis on the CNC. And I would use that as a reference point on the table and on the leg. So hopefully the leg and the table would then line up. So in Fusion, which is where I did this first leg, it doesn't really seem to have a roughing pass option. I basically used the finishing pass by moving the z-axis out from the center. So I'd get a wider, or a sort of a bigger circle of cut. And that was going along fine until the bit jammed, and I was a little bit too low on the z-axis and was cutting a little bit too deep. So I just moved the 0 point of the z-axis up, and this meant that it cut off a little less. You can kind of see that here. I think it took 3 passes to get down to my original depth. And it's a matter of just going around and around with the bit, cutting off a little bit more each time. The top of the leg, so where the seam interfaces with the bottom of the table, is getting a little chipped out. I was thinking I should leave more material up there so it's not such a sharp edge that's being cut. In the end, this wasn't too bad, and I was able to fix a lot of that chip out. But at this point, it looked kind of awful. I lengthened the tenon just a little bit so I could hold on to it better on the CNC. So I took that part off. And I wanted to see if it kind of had the same shape as the bottom of the table and was going to match up. And it looked like it was going to be pretty good. So I ended up cutting the tenon off. It was at about this point that Autodesk decided to not give away the 4th axis part of Fusion for free anymore. So I was kind of stuck as I was in the middle of a project and the tool got taken away. So after a month of kind of trying to figure out what I was going to do, I started on the second leg. And with this leg, I got a 4x4 post and cut it into 4 pieces and made a big block to cut the leg out of. I glued 2 together, then jointed a face of the 2 glued together and sort of folded that onto itself and made a 4-piece block that would have the diameter that I needed, which was really only slightly more than the 2.5 inches of the post, but it was a little bigger, so I couldn't just use the post by itself. I had actually had this glued the other way around, so the grain was different, and I realized that if I flipped everything around, I could have the side grain sort of a quarter sawn look to the leg instead of a flat sawn. I printed out a side view of the leg, and I could use that kind of as a rough shape to cut off the extra bit of this block. And I cut off a large part of the mass of this block with the bandsaw. I'm removing material that I don't have to cut off with the CNC router bit. So I did 2 sides, then I glued those 2 sides back on again with hot glue. Then I could cut the other 2 sides and get all 4 sides cut. And I made the wide part a little rounder by cutting the corners off. This will just speed up the time on the lathe. So something I've wanted to try for a while is to make a piece that interfaces with the chuck on the 4th axis of the CNC. The chuck that comes with this machine is really more of a metalworking chuck. So it holds the piece at 4 points. So what I thought would be a nice thing to do would be to make a piece of wood that would fit into the jaws of the chuck and allow the chuck to hold onto the workpiece a lot better. Give the chuck a lot more surface to hold on to. So after a couple of different cutouts and some different designs and different sizes, I came up with a piece that can be screwed to the end of the workpiece and allow the chuck to hold on really well. And it seems to work. I marked spots with the CNC to drill holes for the screws. Then I drilled the actual holes on the drill press. I can attach this to the end of the workpiece. I made a hole in the center of this piece so that I could see the center of the workpiece. And I can also use it to hold it on my regular lathe. I can turn off the corners. And really, this is just taking off more material that I don't have to take off with the CNC. I'm doing all of this basically just to save the router bit a little bit of work. So here you can see how the chuck interfaces with the piece that I made for the end of the workpiece. So what I came up with for the legs is to move the legs from Fusion over to Aspire, and Aspire allows me to make the G-code for the 4th axis machine. The only problem with this is it doesn't seem that you can keep the center point in exactly the same place when you move the model. So I couldn't figure out a way to make the mortise and tenon work, as I couldn't snap to the center of that tenon on the workpiece in Aspire. Although one thing that's nice with Aspire is it has both a roughing pass and a finishing pass. So I could remove the material with the roughing pass, which is what this is, and gives kind of the step down look. Then I could do the finishing pass and get to the final surface. I think on both of these I did several passes of each with the Z-axis getting closer and closer to the center. So this is sort of a roughing finishing pass. And I was still getting chip out on the top edge of the leg, but in the end this wasn't too big of a deal. So this is the actual finishing pass, which is the same, I just made the step overs a little tighter. Then leg number 2 is done, and I will have to figure out a way to attach the legs to the bottom of the table. I have an idea at this point. I did hit one of the screws with the router, but it ended up not really being that big of a deal. One of the screws that holds my plate to the 4th axis chuck. One side benefit of cutting a piece to fit into the chuck like this, I can take the piece off of the 4th axis and put it back on again in exactly the same place. When I hit that screw, I took it off, took that plate off, put shorter screws in, and put it back on again, and it worked perfectly. Here I'm basically cutting off the top, and I can't cut any deeper than those screws. So I'm sort of marking a place to cut it with the bandsaw. Then I can remove my shaped plate. I'm not sure what to call that. It's sort of a chuck interface. And I can cut off the extra bit on the bandsaw. Then sand off the last bit and get the piece flat and ready to go on the table. For the third leg, I really wanted to try making a segmented piece that I could cut on the fourth axis. So I have some maple that I cut up at my father-in-law's house, I think it was 3 years ago. Bonnie helped with some of the slabbing too. And I got a piece of that maple. It looks to be really nice. It's super clear, very even, cuts really nice. So I jointed this piece and made it into a strip so I can cut segments out of it. Cut it to size on the table saw, then planed it to the right thickness, and I could cut segments out of it. So I just made sort of big, thick, chunky segments for this. Really, I just need lots of mass. I did 8-sided rings. I figured this would be a little quicker than doing 12. Then it was just a matter of gluing them up into rings. I just put glue on and then clamp them with the band clamps, or the hose clamps, I guess. So the upper section of the leg I figured would be rings, and the lower section I would just make sort of a vertical piece as the leg starts to get skinny at the lower section. So I glued up a piece for that part just to get the thickness that I needed. Then I sanded the faces of the rings so the rings would go together nice and tight. I wanted to make a mortise and tenon between the lower vertical part of the leg and the upper ringed section of the leg. So I drilled a hole into the lowest ring. Then I could glue all the rings together. I did them in pairs and then glued the pairs together.
Why is this not working?
Or I guess I glued 2 and 3 and then glued them all together. I can cut a tenon on the vertical table on the CNC machine, which I haven't used in a little while, so it took some setup to get it back working again. So I'm just going to cut a 1-inch dowel into the end of a piece of maple. So I think the drill bit I used was a 1-inch hole, and I drew a 1-inch circle, and I cut that out a little bit big. Then I did a finishing pass at exactly 0 offset, and it fit perfectly. Usually I have to offset a few thousandths in or out to get things to fit. So this router bit must be exactly 1/2 inch. Then it was just a matter of gluing the 2 halves together. Oops. So I put some glue in the mortise and glue on the tenon and push the 2 together. And I clamped it just to push it in as much as it could and keep it in place. Then I can attach my chuck interface plate to the bottom of the third leg. You can see the little hole that I used to find the center of the workpiece. Then I just remove some of this material, just make it a little easier on the CNC. This maple cuts really nice. I can put it on the 4th axes. And then it's the same drill where I cut the roughing pass, and I did this a couple of times. And the step down look is kind of cool. It would be neat to actually do a table this way and leave the contoured look of the underside of the table as well. I can do the finishing pass. One thing that would be cool is if you could set it to ramp down on the first cut. As it goes through the first cut, it's cutting the full width of the router bit. So it always sounds horrible, like it's getting bogged down. But once it does the first cut, then it's easy because it's only taking off the amount that it's stepping over. So it'd be nice if it would do a couple of passes to get down to the depth that it wants to cut on the first pass, if that makes sense. I also just barely had enough thickness at the seam where the mortise and tenon is, but it turned out to be fine. And I can take the third leg off. And I'll do the same thing where I'll turn off just a little bit of the end and start to make that cut of the top, which is basically a marker that I could follow when I use the bandsaw. With this one, I left a little more material at the top, and the wood is a lot nicer. I didn't get as much chip out at the top edge with the router bit. And I can take my little plate off. Finally have all three legs, and this one looks like it's going to be a good size. And I can cut off the extra bit at the top and sand the last bit at the top smooth and flat. And I had a little extra bit at the bottom of the leg too. So all three legs weren't quite the same length. So I found a level spot on one of my work tables, and I could use that to get the three legs fairly close to the same length. Because there's three legs, they don't have to be exactly the same length, as they'll form a tripod. But if I want the top to be somewhat level, then I want the legs to be pretty close. So doing it with a level worked. My idea for attaching the legs to the table was to use a two-ended screw and attach it to the leg, then drill a hole as close as I could figure into the bottom of the table for that screw, and then just sort of screw the leg onto the table. And there were two issues. One was getting the leg in the right place and having the threads of the screw tighten up at the right place in the rotation of the leg. As the leg isn't round, it needs to stop rotating at the right place. That was actually the harder issue, and I ended up just having to tighten them up a little bit to make them work. Once I had the legs on, I then could sand the top. I used my drum sander. This was sort of perfect for this because I can run the top over the drum sander, and the shape of the piece doesn't matter. It took several passes, but this did work pretty well. You can start to see the top taking shape and what the table is going to look like. I did end up taking the legs off and putting bigger threaded screws in place. Since I knew the location at this point, I just had to make the holes a little bigger, as they didn't feel like they were being held on as well as they could be. With bigger screws, it feels fine. Then I did a lot of sanding on the underside of the table. I started with the grinder and a sanding disc. Then I used my orbital sander, and this worked pretty well, but it's such a big piece of sandpaper on a curvy surface. So I went to my smaller orbital sander that I use on the lathe a lot, and that worked better. Then what really worked well was my angled drill that I use on the lathe for sanding, and this worked really well, as I was able to get into a lot of the spaces of the shape of the table. So I did a lot of the big material removing with the grinder, like shaping the interface between the top and the legs, which was pretty close but not perfect. And then I did the sanding really with the drill. Then I got the grinder back out and did the edge, as it was, the bark was off, but it still needed to be cleaned up. So I just kind of went at it with the grinder. This went actually pretty fast and worked pretty well. And I went back over this with the drill just to get the sanding marks out. Then it was time for finish. I used polyurethane. Since it's mostly end grain, it really soaked in. This definitely wasn't about putting some on and pushing it around. Basically, you put some on and it soaked in, and you didn't have any to push around. The first coat took a lot. I think I put a second coat on the bottom and I sanded, and a second coat on the top and then sanded, and then a third coat, which is what I'm doing here. I was actually lucky in that I finished this a day before my mom's birthday, and it was just the perfect thing to give her for her birthday. So we took it over there to my parents' house, and they have it at their house. This version was figuring out the process both in the computer and in the shop to make this idea work. So I really want to get to the walnut version now. Thanks for watching.